Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Professor of Geophysics at this University in Cambridge, distinguished geophysicist, but he carries out a night job as well, which is as the director of the Faraday Institute. So, and he's done a great deal today to arrange this conference together with his colleagues here in Cambridge. I wanted to express our gratitude to him for doing that. Talk about disasters or something.
Natural disasters, thank you. Yes. You might think it's a bit strange for me to talk about natural disasters and acts of God, because the very term acts of God, which was created by the legal people in the mid-19th century, meant things that have no human interaction. But it was a good choice because it was remembering that all nature is under the sovereignty of God. There are not things that happen without God's sovereignty, so nature is what God does. And sometimes we make that mistake today, don't we? We say, where was God in natural disasters? He couldn't have been there. Well, of course he was there. He's sovereign over everything. And I think natural disasters can present quite a challenge both to people of faith and people of no faith. To people of faith, because they say, how can a good and loving God, all-powerful God, allow this? To people of no faith, because it challenges the hubris of our age, which says we can deal with any problem, we can deal with illness and sickness, and in fact we'd rather not think about death. And it brings you face to face with the reality of death. And it's interesting that Jesus was asked, you might remember, a tower fell down in Siloam, it's related by Luke, and it killed 18 people, and people came to him and said, who sinned? Was it the people who died, or was it their fathers? And Jesus said, as he often did, it's entirely the wrong question. He said, watch out, or you too will suffer the same fate. In other words, you too will die. And he was pointing not to the fact that they wouldn't die, but to the fact that the real issue was your relationship to God, and you had to get that right before you died. And I think actually natural disasters do have that effect. They really remind us of our mortality sometimes. We soon forget, I think. The other thing perhaps to say, and I want to draw out in this talk, is that natural phenomena, earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, and so on, are part of God's good creation of this world. If it weren't for that, this would be a sterile world. The very fact that humanity and life can survive here is because of that plate tectonic cycle of volcanoes that bring nutrients to the surface, of floods that replenish the fields. Just think of the Nile, the whole economy of Egypt, and so on. They are not evil in themselves. And the thing that happens when those natural phenomena interact with humans, that's when you get a natural disaster. And I just want to show you that humans may not always be culpable, but there are very specific and very obvious instances when we humans either make a natural disaster much worse or indeed create it by our activity. Now this is some statistics for the last 25 years. And they show that the number of recorded disasters per year has increased, particularly from cyclones and floods. As you can see, earthquakes are pretty much the same now as they always have been, as far as we can tell. Number of recorded disasters is a bit of a hard, not necessarily a very good measure, because it's like crime statistics. You know, if the government wants to get crime down, you get more reported crimes. So that may be the case here, but look at this. This is a really interesting diagram if we just unpack it a bit. The same period, 25 years, it's excluded what are called mega disasters. Those are disasters that kill more than 10,000 people because they sort of unsettle the trends. So it's got the underlying day-by-day trends. And we've heard about population increase, and for sure, as I'll show you in a minute, population increase means that more people are vulnerable. But look at the blue curve, which is due to climatic effects. That is increasing at a faster rate than, that is increasing at a faster rate over this period than the increase of population, which is the black line. Now that tells you that climate change is causing more fatalities per year and at a faster rate than just the population growth. So one thing I particularly want to point out is that climate change, what we are doing is killing people. And it is killing more people year by year. And the people it is killing is not, by and large, us who caused it, apart from the odd, I shouldn't just say a couple of people because they're important, but 2 people in Tewkesbury in the floods locally. But it is killing people, by and large, in countries in Asia, in Africa, and so on, who did not cause the problem in the first place. And it's affecting people who are poor and marginalised already. So there's a real ethical problem and a moral problem that we need to face. I think that's a striking statistic. If we look at large earthquakes now, these are earthquakes that kill more than 10,000 people over the past 1,000 years. Look how much that is increasing year by year. It's getting worse and worse. And this is because there is a bigger population now than there used to be in the past, and because more people live in megacities. And it's almost certain that within our lifetime, of most of us here, there will be a catastrophe from an earthquake that will kill more than 1 million people. In fact, there's already been one you probably don't realise, because it was in China during the communist era that killed about 650,000 people. And that's purely because of the increase in population. It is getting a more dangerous world. And that actually challenges our hubris that with technology we can solve everything. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Now I want to talk about 3 issues: scientific issues, a little bit about theology and ethics, and some practical issues just at the end. So I'll start with the scientific issues. Volcanic eruptions are the sort of poster boy of disasters because they're so photogenic, but in fact they actually don't kill many people, because usually they give warning of eruptions and you get out of the way. This is actually Krakatoa, just a son of Krakatoa, Anna Krakatoa, erupting in 1964. But just to reinforce something that was said earlier, that Tambora, when it erupted in 1815, as Cal I think said, actually put so much dust into the atmosphere that it caused actually spectacular sunsets for about 3 years, and maybe that's why Turner painted those beautiful sunsets in that same period. But also it caused famine from crop failure on the other side of the world, in North America and other places, and an estimated 90,000 people died from famine as a secondary effect. The actual eruption didn't kill many people. Now here's a classic case where a massive eruption, and this is the biggest known eruption in historic times, of Akrotiri, Santorini in the Aegean, 1628 BC, through 60 cubic kilometres of ash blasted into the atmosphere. A massive eruption destroyed the island. There was a Mycenaean habitation city there at the time called Akrotiri, and it was buried by ash. You can go and see it now, and there are pots preserved with grain in them still, beautiful frescoes and so on. And the interesting thing is, this did not kill a single person in Akrotiri, as far as we can tell. The only skeleton that's been found is of a pig. It's clear that people got away because there were probably earthquakes and warnings before the big eruption. And some people think this collapsed staircase, which this is a Bronze Age village now exposed from being dug out of the ash, was caused by an earthquake. Possibly that is the case. So volcanoes, not so dangerous, but interestingly the ash from this went all over the eastern Mediterranean. We've written a paper saying that it may well have been that ashfall and the tsunami that accompanied this which gave rise to the famines at the time of Joseph in Egypt. Now, not so lucky, or not such a happy outcome, was Martinique, Saint-Pierre, on Ascension Day 1902. And this is a case where human intervention comes into it, because this was a similar sort of volcano. It had been erupting since the 23rd of April in small ways, and there had been earthquakes and ash falls for 2 weeks. And the authorities tried to stop people leaving because there were elections coming up that weekend, and the mayor in particular tried to get people not only not to leave, but to come into the capital, Saint-Pierre. Now, some people did leave, the steamers were crowded, but between 26 and 36,000 people didn't. This eruption made a cloud of burning gas at 1,000 degrees centigrade, roared down through the city, down the valley, killed the mayor and his wife and between 26 and 36,000 other people within the space of about 2 or 3 minutes, and then it had rolled over. They just suffocated because the hot ash burnt up the air. Only 2 people survived. One of them was this character, Ludger Silbaris, who'd been chucked into prison the day before. It's unclear whether it was just for general riotous behaviour, which he was renowned for, or whether he'd actually killed somebody. And he's put in solitary confinement in an old magazine, which was deep down beneath the building, had no windows, just had a vent in the door. He survived, he held his breath, he actually peed on his towel and put it in the only vent in the bottom of the door, and they eventually found him 4 days later, dragged him out. He was very burnt, but he was alive, and they gave him a pardon, actually. Thought he deserved it. And he died of natural old age in 1929. In the meantime, he became a freak in the Barnum and Bailey show, which was going around North America at the time. They put him in a little sort of replica of the prison that he was in, that he survived. Now, this is a case where human intervention certainly exacerbated that disaster, because they actually prevented people leaving, for reasons of power, really. The Haze famine, the biggest eruption in that century in Iceland, followed an eruption in 1793 called the Lakagiga eruption, and I work in Iceland, I've been to see this. The following winter, 76% of the horses, 50% of the cows, and 79% of the sheep died. We now know they died from fluoridosis, fluorine poisoning, because there was a lot of fluorine in the volcanic gases, which was noxious, and they left them outside. No humans were killed by this eruption at all. Because the lava flows down, it just got out of the way. It burnt up 5 farms, which wasn't good news for those farmers, but the people and their families were not killed. But that next winter, 25% of the humans died of starvation because the livestock had died. Now, this is another really interesting case where human intervention would have saved them all, because it was well known this was going on. Benjamin Franklin actually wrote a paper in the Manchester Philosophical Guardian about this eruption, and Iceland was a vassal state of Denmark at the time. The Danish could have sent a relief ship very easily with supplies, and they didn't. And people starved to death as a result. So I would maintain that this is a natural disaster, but actually it was human intervention which changed it from a natural phenomenon to be a disaster. That's volcanoes, earthquakes. This is making the point about population density. These square dots are cities, megacities really. Small squares more than 5 million people, large squares more than 10 million people. And I'm going to show you next devastating earthquakes that kill more than 50,000 and more than 100,000 people. And just look how they line up with where the cities are. Almost the same place. Let's go back again. The red ones are more than 10,000, the yellow ones are more than 100,000 people died. People live in dangerous places and they live in big cities, and we could now add another yellow circle for the Chinese earthquake that just occurred this last month, Sichuan. Now, earthquakes too are almost impossible to predict, although advanced countries like California and, not a country, state like California and Japan actually now have automatic warning systems that are so fast that they can locate and detect an earthquake, send an electronic signal to other places in the country at the speed of light, because it's electronic, which beats the seismic waves getting there, which travel at about 4,000 or 5,000 meters per second. And if you've got 10 seconds warning, it's enough to dive under a reinforced desk. So you can actually, with technology, save lives there. But there are many instances where you can't. And here's another instance of the way that we value human life. This earthquake was the last big earthquake, really, in California, 1989, magnitude 6.9. It killed a total of 57 people, mostly when freeways collapsed. And there's 2 examples of that here, and crushed people in their cars. These freeways were actually being reinforced at the time, but they haven't got round to these. Now, here's an earthquake of similar magnitude, which happened the next year, which killed between 17 and 40,000. Indeed, in southern India, there was an earthquake that killed about 30,000 of similar magnitude. Why weren't those people saved? Well, the reason is they lived in mud huts with roofs made of just thatch and so on, held on with fronds mostly, held on with rocks. When the earthquake came, the rocks fell on them and killed them. For the investment of a few tens of dollars per household, you would have saved their lives with plastic roofing, corrugated roofing, for example. That's, I think, inequity, moral inequity in the world, because a life is valued in California at many tens of millions of dollars and much less in India. There must be something wrong there. But even in this earthquake in Izmit in Turkey, they had perfectly good building codes. They know how to build, because they always get earthquakes there. But what happened was there were greedy builders who did not keep to the codes. They found instances afterwards of empty oil cans put in the walls to save concrete when they poured concrete. And the result is that buildings fall down and kill people. And this is a very striking picture here. There's a mosque here with a wooden minaret, 100 feet or so tall. And it survived. It was several hundred years old. It survived the earthquake. They knew how to build. Whereas all around it is devastation that killed thousands of people from tower blocks which have been shoddily built, not because they didn't know how to build them, but because builders were greedy and cut corners. And interestingly, here's the actual fault break. This chicken is just stepping across it. That is it. And it went right through this house. And look, there's no problem with the house. It's got a bit distorted. They've got cross-braced wood with brick, and it might be a bit hard to close the door now, I suspect. But it didn't fall down. A really interesting moral issue here, isn't there, of the fact that human greed can cause unnecessary deaths and suffering. It's not just down to nature, so-called. Well, I think, as I said at the beginning, global warming is implicated in changes, and we've heard this already from, I think, Sir John, that floods and droughts are a big issue. This is Hurricane Katrina. Interesting study, isn't there, in North America, very advanced technological nation. There was something like 1,000 people, killed in New Orleans, and the people that were killed were the poor, by and large, and the very elderly, who didn't get away. The poor because they didn't have cars, and the state didn't provide buses to evacuate them, and the elderly because they couldn't. It's always the vulnerable that suffer. And I think, in a way, this is a wake-up call. Technology does not buy you out of those moral issues. They're still there. And floods, of course, are one of the world's main killers. We've heard this before. I don't know, many of you will have been alive on the 13th of November 1970. Do you remember in Bangladesh, on that day, that more than 500,000 people died? I mean, Burma is a more recent example. That's before the flooding, that's after it. These are satellite photos, and you can see the areas of the Irrawaddy in the south here now inundated. And as you well know, there's huge suffering which has been exacerbated, I think, by the people in power in Burma wanting to stay in power, basically, and keeping out aid. As far as one can tell, 130,000 died and 2.5 million or so severely affected by that. This is a moral issue. If you live somewhere like this and it floods, you're likely to drown. You certainly lose what little shelter you have. And floods, historically, have killed many millions of people. 1887, I talked earlier about the increase of population. Well, there was a lot smaller population in 1887, but there were floods in the Yellow River that killed between 1 and 2 million people. Again, in 1931, estimates are hard to work out for these things, but maybe up to nearly 4 million people died in floods in 31, and lots more people. There's 4 times as many people in the world now as there were in 1931. So it's been estimated that through the last century, floods affected something like 100 million people per year. By 2025, the rate we're going, half the world's population will be at risk from storms. It's obviously wise because you live in river valleys where there's water, or by the sea where there's communications. And this is a big statistic. And what it will mean is that there will be a lot of environmental refugees. This is one estimate, there will be a couple of 100 million refugees. And at least for my money, I suspect that refugees will be the biggest problem that we face, at least in this country, as a result of global climate change. Because, to be honest, we don't like people coming in, do we? We're not very welcoming to a foreigner on our shores. And indeed, what humans fight wars over is over territory, over boundaries. But if you can't live in your bit of land because it's been flooded or it's been inundated by seawater so you can't grow crops, you have to leave. And that's what you fight wars over. Well, something like 100 million people will be affected by a 1 metre sea level rise. The best estimate from the IPCC this century is about ½ metre, but that doesn't have feedbacks from melting of glaciers, which apparently are accelerating, so I guess 1 metre is a more realistic estimate. A lot of people affected. Here's a little animation of Europe. 1 metre inundation would do that, and this will just go through 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 metres of inundation. Well, it's pretty bad news for the Netherlands, but they're rich enough to build sea defences, and they will do so, and they are doing so. And the same thing for us. We're just about to increase the height of the Thames Barrier. We can do that, but you can't do it in the Irrawaddy Delta. You can't do it in Bangladesh. You don't have that option. It's been touched on, the effect of hunger. Let me just show you these statistics. This is from the IPCC, the last report. The effect of 2 degrees or 4 degrees sea rise is estimated risk of hunger in millions of people. Well, it won't really affect Europe. In fact, it might be easier, both in Europe and Australasia and North America, We might initially grow crops better. But this is where it begins to bite. South America, 10 to 85 million people. Asia, 30 to nearly 300 million people. Africa, perhaps 60 to 200 million people, will go hungry because of climate change. This is a moral issue. It's hard to work out deaths from disease and so on, but even if the numbers aren't right, and this was a paper published in Nature, so it has some veracity, but look where the deaths occur. You're more likely to die if it's hot from disease, because if you're already living on the edge or you're malnourished, then that little bit will push you over. The people who suffer in Asia, Africa, South America are not the people that cause the problem, who are in the green areas of North America and Europe and Australia. That's why it's a moral problem. And we've seen this sort of picture before. A sixth of the world population, that's us, are responsible for more than half of the pollution, but mostly the people that suffer, the sixth that haven't produced it. This picture too was shown last time. I like this animation because its correlation, it's a geological one because I'm a geologist, goes back through the last ice age. But it is just striking. I think Al Gore shows this, and you've all seen Al Gore's graph. We are outside the range humans have ever experienced on this earth before. We're in an interglacier, so it's already hot, and we're going hotter. There are no analogues in the past, but we do know the Earth in the distant past has been hot. There's no problem with it getting hotter, and I find that scary because it will get hotter. What about then some theological issues? Well, I don't want to talk too much about other religions, but just to point out again that a lot of religions have concern for the environment. The Quran, God is the creator of everything and he has charge over everything. Buddhist teaching says there's an endless cycle, so every article entrusted to us must be used with good care in some useful way because we only have it on loan, temporarily, if you will. Even atheism, E.O. Wilson, perhaps one of the world's leading biologists, recently wrote a book addressed to a mythical Southern Baptist pastor, and he was chairman of the American Humanist Society, and he said this in that book. He said, I'm a secular humanist, but religion and science are the two most powerful forces in the world today, so if they could be united on a common ground, in his case of biological conservation, he said, the problem would soon be solved. Now I think people of religious faith are crucial in this, because they can hopefully step outside the immediate issues of financial gain, which drives so much else of society, and also because they are spread globally. It's a global problem, so it needs global solutions. But as I say, I'll just concentrate, because I've only got time now, on the Christian response, and I just want to give you 4 little pointers to why we should care for the environment. The first one is that God cares for the world, so we should. It's pretty clear that God thinks the world is good. If you look at his mission statement, say, Genesis 1 is his mission statement, everything he created, you know, the dry land, the sea, the animals, the vegetables, the sun, the moon, and everything else. It's as if at the end of each day he sat down and said, that was a good day's work, that was good. And at the end of all of it, he sat down, he looked at everything he'd made, and he said it was very good. Now that means matter matters to God. It's a very materialistic religion. It's very grounded in the earth, which I like because I'm a geologist, as I say. And we do wrong to spiritualize this problem. It's a very grounded problem. What we do with this earth really matters, because that's the sort of creator God we have if you're a Christian. He really cares about it. We are embodied people. And we've had lots of examples from Michael about the way he cares for the world. Here's just one more. The lions roar for their prey. Who do they seek their food from? From God. Psalm 104. And lots of other examples. So God cares for us. Another one which Michael showed, it was actually the very first commandment that God gave to humankind, was that we should care for his earth. Genesis 1:28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Sometimes we talk about this as stewardship, which is fine, but actually I think it's a bit stronger than that. It's having dominion over it. It's having to rule over it and keep it in order on God's behalf. That's the commandment he gave us. And because we're made in the image of God, presumably some of the ways we should do this are in the ways that he would do it. In other words, compassionately, with care for others, and not for our own gain, not for our own glory. At the time Genesis 1 was written, probably around this sort of time. This is an example of an image of the ruler, which was set up on the boundaries of his land that he ruled over. And these images were set up, it's like putting the image of the Queen on our coins. It's to say, I rule here, this is my land, this is my image, and it is ruled by me in my way. And in a way, that's what God is asking us to do. He's asking us to be stewards on his behalf, to have dominion indeed, to rule over the earth. And perhaps if we want to see an example of how that's done, there's no better example, of course, than God himself becoming incarnate on earth, of Jesus. The way he ruled as a shepherd king, if you like, as a servant king towards us. So 2 reasons: God cares, so we should care about it. God commanded us, that's pretty unambiguous, he told us to do it. And the third reason is a community. You'll notice the C's, actually, it's a bit like a sermon heading, you can write down the 3 C's. Because of care for neighbour. Lots of examples of that. Here's just one from Jesus speaking. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. From the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. Well, that's us. We've been entrusted with a great deal. And if we're to love our neighbour, to love God and love our neighbour as ourselves, that really means that what we do here, if our neighbour is on the other side of the world and suffers the consequences of it, or indeed if our neighbour is the next generation or the generation after that to come, that is part of what we have to do. We have to care for them. Now, Margaret Thatcher isn't somebody I often quote, but this is a great quote, actually. She was onto this issue a long time before others, really. She said, "We do not hold a freehold on our world, but only a full repairing lease. We have a moral duty to look after our world and to hand it on in good order to future generations." And Christopher Patton, in his Reith lectures in 2000, put it a bit more pithily. He said, "Living here as though we were intending to stay for good and not just for the weekend." So we should care for the world because of love for other people. Now, I think, actually, those 3 things, caring for the world, caring for others, caring for the neighbour, most of the world, even the secular world, would sign up to those. They'd say, yeah, of course that's a good thing to do. We should do that. Now, I think the last point I want to make is a specifically Christian point, which they might not sign up to, but I think is a very compelling point, which is that the Bible says there will be a new creation. There is a hope for the future. There's a Christian hope for the future. There will be a new heaven and new earth, where God himself will come down to this earth. It talks about recreating it in the way it was meant to be. No more crying or tears or mourning. It'll be the sort of place it meant to be before it was spoiled by sin and rebellion against God. And that's a great hope to look forward to. The kingdom of heaven is here already, in some extent, and so we should be working in this world because it has a long-term future. And what we do now has consequences for the future. I think that's a really important driver for Christian care. I mean, after all, we're going to be doing this for eternity, so we might as well start now. C.S. Lewis said that the Christians who did most for the present world were precisely those who thought most of the next. He was really making the same point. Aim at heaven and you get earth thrown in, aim at earth and you get neither, he said. So there's 4 just little pointers to how we should care for the world from a theological point of view. And then lastly, I said I'd just look at some practical issues. So let's just do that now. Well, here's a big list of do's and don'ts for individuals. Let me just show them to you. I wonder if you sign up to these. You know, don't drive so much, don't drive a big car, don't drive a fuel-intensive car, don't drive a heaven, don't fly anywhere, get on your bike, go for a walk, turn the right hand, cross the freezer, pick double glazing, insulate your lock, insulate your hot water tank, insulate your pipes, get a renewable energy supply, don't buy acids for. I mean, lots of these things we all know about, don't we? We should do these not because of legalistic reasons, but as I said, because it's one day of worship of God, of being obedient to God, our Creator, and because of the impact on other people. So individuals can do a lot. At a communal sense, groups of people, I think a lot of people here are from faith communities. Faith communities can have a huge impact because they should be modelling this sort of life, it seems to me. Things like sharing cars, sharing garden equipment, putting pressure on governments, Tier Fund does some great campaigns, just getting educated about things, things that are good to do and things that aren't. And there are, as I said before, there are groups, say of Christians, if we take Christians, a faith group, throughout every patch of this land, throughout the whole world. And a lot of these communities are linked up with communities overseas, so perhaps we know more about what's going on than many secular individuals do who aren't linked in this way. I mean, many of us support aid work overseas or missionary work and pray with others and so on. So I think we are much more powerful as faith groups than we sometimes give credence for, and we should be pressurising government to do things. Now, I don't want to talk about national policies. There are lots of things, we've heard about some of them here today. That book that Dennis mentioned has got a whole chapter on some of these issues, also international level. But I think one of the issues which we see again and again is that governments are elected for 4 years, and really what they care most about is getting re-elected next time round. And clearly that's, when you read the newspapers, that's what the newspaper pundits care about. It is very hard to get them to take account of things with a longer horizon than that. And look at this quote from John Kennedy in 1961. He saw the Russians had put a satellite, Sputnik, around the Earth. He said, "I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." Well, I was of that era that grew up in that space age and saw that happen, and they did it. Amazingly, astonishingly, really. We could do it too, with climate change. We could do some of these measures, and I think, as I said right at the beginning, the issue is not that we don't know what we should do, and it's not even that we don't really know how to do it, because we have lots of ideas. It's that we really don't want to do it, and that is a real big issue. So I think I'll stop there, which will give plenty of time for questions, which I'll be glad to answer. Thank you very much.
And questions for Bob?
Peter Ward is my name, I'm an engineer. I have enormous sympathy for what the last two speakers have said. At the same time, we live in a much wider world. I remember from childhood that I was actually deeply moved by the teaching of Jesus Christ, as I read it in the Gospels, and I was much moved by it, if not more, than by the sentiments of Brahms and Beethoven and so on. I found it enormous. But we live in a much wider world, and that world embraces other religions, and it seems to me that if we took the ethics of these religions, which seem to have a great deal in common, I mean, from superficial travel, superficial reading, superficial conversations, I would judge they do have a lot in common. It would be great if the theologians could get together, and perhaps going back to Aristotle as well, create an ethical handbook which would embrace us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Another question.
Now, was that a question or?
No, I agree with that. I mean, mostly, as I say, we know what to do, but we don't do it.
One other point. Are you sure, do you feel sure, that the ecology that, I mean, if we think of diet, to which you referred, do you think the ecology may well survive? An ecology, but it might not involve us.
That's perfectly feasible, isn't it? I think humankind is quite capable of destroying themselves. And Martin Rees, actually, who's president of the Royal Society now, a very senior scientist, published a book a few years ago called, I forget the exact title, but he said there's only a 50% chance. The last century, that's right, there's only a 50% chance of human surviving the century. Now, I don't believe that, because I think the Christian message is one of hope for the future, and we saw Michael put up as long as seed time endures, you know, harvest will still come. But so I'm not hopeless, but we do have to act.
But about the ethical teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we better take another question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I was interested in the loving your neighbour as yourself, which has come through as a theme on several occasions today. I'm surprised that some writers in this field don't make more of Paul's injunction when he's doing the collection, when he's writing to the Corinthians, and says that you can give out of your plenty, not so that you'd be in need and they'd have more than enough, but that you should both have enough. There's this principle of both having enough. Yeah. Is there a need for a far, far more radical line of teaching amongst the Christian churches on actually living out of your need and then giving the rest away? I'm thinking of Wesley, if I have more than £10 left when I die, call me a thief.
Yeah. Absolutely agree with you. I mean, it is a profoundly Christian perspective to give up something for the sake of others, and Christ did that supremely.
Can I suggest to look at the TFO's website and look at the My Global Impact section? You find at least a start on precisely that principle.
Yeah, as I say, it is a
And
profoundly...
perhaps you'd all like to look at that, because I think it's the principle of sharing is a very important one for us to follow. And sharing our wealth is asking people and the rest.
Thank you. Yeah, there are TFO booklets called For Tomorrow Too, which you can pick up free from the bookstore on the way out. So if you haven't seen that, it's very useful with guidelines and things as well.
Hi there, I'm from the, can you hear me? I'm from the British Ecological Society, and this is actually more of a personal question. I don't know about anybody else, but I actually find it really hard to find my way through these kind of ethical issues. I mean, when you're thinking about your impact in terms of buying local food or buying in-season fruits, like you mentioned, what's the ethical position of doing that compared to withdrawing trade from foreign countries, for example?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, if we all stopped buying flowers flown in from Kenya, then there would be 10,000 Kenyas out of a livelihood. I think it's something that you shouldn't change overnight, but you should evolve towards a sustainable way. And there are ways of doing things which are better than other ways. There are some amazing statistics. We ship, I forget the figure, 30,000 gallons of water to Australia every year, mineral water, and we ship back about the same amount from Australia. Isn't that ludicrous? It's just water. So look, these issues aren't very nuanced, and I think there's no sort of simple answer. These things are complicated, but I think where we're aiming for is pretty clear. So I think you do have to get educated. Just while the microphone's going there, I'll just tell you a little story. I sat at a dinner after one of these Faraday events next to a Nobel Prize winner. He'd discovered something amazing. And I was talking about low energy and stuff like this. And he said, oh, I don't use low energy light bulbs. I said, why not? He said, this is a physicist. He discovered quasars or something. He said, well, because, I go down to the supermarket, it costs £2.50, and a normal bulb costs 50p, so that's not a good investment. And I said, I don't normally do this after dinner, I have to say, but I said, well, let's just assume it's a 100-watt bulb, it's in your porch, it's on all night, so that's 10 hours a night, average through the year. 100-watt bulb, that's 1 unit a night, 10p a night, so that costs you 36 quid a year in electricity. If you have a low energy light bulb, it will use a quarter of it, use 25 quid a year. So that difference between 50p and £2.50 is nothing compared to the overall energy saving. He said, yeah, that's right, it's incredibly clever physicist. So I hadn't thought about that. So these things, that's why I say get educated. These things bear on
Really get educated. It's actually better to buy flowers from South Africa. This is to buy flowers in the winter that have been grown in that easy greenhouse in the UK.
Indeed.
So there's all sorts of uses.
Yeah.
We have had some excellent presentations today based on science and religion. I'm wondering whether you'd like to say something about which of these do you think could be a hopeful basis for a global ethic in relation to the environment?
Oh, without question, religion. I think the only thing that has a long-term future on this earth is, well, I think Christianity, because I think that's a true one, but faith. If you read Revelation 17, say, which I was preaching on recently, civilizations come and go. They've come and they've gone, and they've come and they've gone, and you can just list them all: Babylonian and Egyptian and Greek and Roman, and they all come and they go. The only steadfast kingdom is the kingdom of Christ. So unambiguous science is great, and I love doing it. And I hope there'll be great science in the new creation, in the new heaven and new earth. I'm really looking forward to volcanic eruptions, earthquakes. They're spectacular, but don't kill anybody.
Well, thank you very much. I think we should stop now.